Welcome to our podcast, Who Were the Muslims? Today, we will be discussing the truth behind the history of Muslims being enslaved. Our podcast focuses around the idea of who Muslims were before the colonization of the Europeans and the image they withheld before terrorism.
In the first segment, Ali and Andrea will be discussing how we define the approach we just studied and what we learned after reading the book. In the second segment, Lizette, Andrea, and Ali and I, Sheila, will be discussing how the approach gave us a new lens on how we view the history and the truths that we have learned.
In the last segment, Sheila and Lizette will be discussing what is revealed through the approach that would be obfuscated and hazy in the study in history. Starting off the first segment, I will be discussing my views on who I've put an image on as quote-unquote slaves. Before reading this book, I would identify slavery associated to only black people being enslaved and white people being slave owners. In the book, it broadens the real history of how African Muslims were among the first to be enslaved. The first memory I have of learning about slavery is reading the book Sweet Clara and the Freedom Quill. In the book, it tells the story of a little girl named Clara and how she has been separated from her mother. At the new plantation Clara is placed at, her Aunt Rachel manages to get her out of the fields and into working as a seamstress at the big house. Clara overhears the white men in the big house talking about runaway slaves and how there's a path to freedom that anyone could follow if they only had a map. She ultimately makes a quote that is a secret map for those who are trying to escape slavery. From elementary school, this book has implanted the images of slaves only picking cotton in fields or doing housework for white people in my head. I had no idea or knowledge about African Muslims being the first enslaved. The approach has definitely helped me gain intelligence and truths behind what Muslims have truly experienced through history.
From my perspective, the approach allowed me to see the connection between race and religion, in this case specifically black and Muslim. I myself would have never associated black people to be predominantly Muslim at a point in time because the culture here in America is so different. Now I realize that it's this way because of slavery. Black Muslims were stripped from their identity and beliefs by colonizers for a long time. It was interesting how after forcefully exposing them to the Christian faith, they felt like they made a mistake because they wanted a clear division between them and their slaves. Having a religion that connected them was not beneficial for their strategy of making them inferior. So they began to let them practice their own religions once more, only to further emphasize that divide.
Throughout this book, a constant battle of the slaveholder trying to strip down the identity, soul, and humanity of the Muslim slave has been a recurring theme. What this has led me to conclude is that the failure of colonialism to break the Muslim identity has led to the current conflict of war and terrorism. They failed to marginalize them, have them accept the values of the U.S. Like on page 123, as it mentions, by persisting in their religious dietary habits, the Muslims were not only remaining faithful to their religion, but they were also retaking control of themselves. They, not their owner, decided what they could eat or drink and when. It was difficult to control the Muslim slaves as their intelligence and spirit was always held on too tightly. When the 9/11 occurred, the U.S. didn't waste a second to point a finger at Muslims as the villain, the monster that has come to strike fear. Could this be connected to their failure to dominate them in slavery? It is clear that as a nation, we have been afraid of Muslims because of jealousy. They demonstrated a way of life with the morals we didn't have. Like said on page 101, more united among themselves than the other nations.
So the way that I see it is I feel like this book makes it clear that the United States is an Islamophobic country because ever since the 9/11, they've been using it as an excuse to be against Muslims, to have war against them. But it has actually started way before that, but they just use it as because we don't know about the past because they tried to erase it. The second segment is how does the approach we just studied provide a unique lens to the study of the past? This approach makes us realize that slavery has always existed and it didn't start with African Americans as we all think, but it actually started with black Muslims. But it was here in America where slavery was based on religion and race. It was here where slaves were brutalized and stripped away from their religion and culture and forced to become Christians. Obviously, in school, we don't go in depth about how they were actually treated, but just briefly see what happened and then just move on. In school, we're also told that slavery was bad and sad, but that we have progress and we're a better country now. But reality is, we're just the same as we were before. Nowadays, the campesinos are treated horrible, getting paid the most minimum and being in the sun for long hours is just another modern way of slavery. Yet they don't tell us that in school because minority groups are the ones that are going through this and not the dominant race like whites. A couple of years ago, I saw a documentary by Vice News that interviewed a lot of different races, and the interview was about taking a job, but it was to work in the field. The only person that said yes to that job was a Hispanic person. This clearly shows how people from the dominant race don't want to do the dirty work and expect the inferior ones to do it. There are all kinds of stereotypes to minority groups.
One thing that we really don't think about is how we learned about human capacity, which ultimately came from slavery because they worked such long hours, they were really put to the test. That's why we learned that the human can't work possibly more than 8 hours without needing a break, or that someone needs to eat every 5 hours if they're working, and how many hours is it that a person needs to sleep. Also, a person can be the oppressor and the victim, just like the U.S. paints themselves as the victim, although we have created the conditions for such events of terror. In a society that is unethical, people who are slaves, whether it's modern slaves or the one during colonialism, you cannot expect them to act ethically. For example, war on terrorism has killed many innocent families. We deny protection to those we have put in terrible conditions and expect the oppressed to act civilized. Just as in the book, as it has been mentioned on page 216, he organized a network of devoted followers and taught them how to make poison, which they use against their owners or against other slaves in order to ruin the slaveholders. Although the Muslims bring death to others, we made this their only option of survival.
Why do you think that?
Well, ultimately, what we didn't learn in history was the truth about Osama bin Laden, which the fact is that he was trained by the United States. He relocated to Peshawar, Afghanistan, and using the aid from the United States under the CIA program, he began training Mujahideen, a group of Islamic jihadists. After the Soviets withdrew from the country in 1989, Osama returned to Saudi Arabia as a hero, and the United States referred to him and his soldiers as freedom fighters, which is something we don't look at, because if he was seen as the person who conducted these terrorist groups, why would we say that he was someone that we kind of ultimately worshipped? But then Osama turned against us because he believed he was a corrupt Saudi government, and his frustration with the U.S. occupation of Saudi Arabia during the Persian Gulf War led to a growing rift between Osama and his country's leaders. He spoke publicly about Saudi's government reliance on American troops, believing their presence profaned sacred soil.
Okay.
The approach we just studied provided a unique lens for me to view the present and past differently. In today's society, not only Americans, but all over the world, people view Muslims as terrorists and as terrible people due to minimal instances. These instances have caused every Muslim person, disregarding even if they were born in America, as a terrorist. Whenever Muslims are spoken about, the topic of how African Muslims were among the enslaved is never brought up. Only the bad things are nationalized. There has even been an incident with a 23-year-old white man named Mark Anthony Condit, who was the mastermind behind a bombing in Austin, Texas, was not labeled as a terrorist. Because Mark is a white Christian American, people debated how he wasn't a terrorist. This shows how uneducated our society can be. I believe that terrorism and terrorists don't associate with one religion or race as a whole. It depends on the action of an individual, and that should determine who is a terrorist, not skin color. The White House press secretary has even denied any link between the Austin bombings and terrorism, even though Austin was terrorized in a 3-week-long serial bombing campaign by Mark. The Austin police chief claims Mark should primarily be seen as a very challenged young man because he did not mention terrorism or hate in the video he left behind before carrying out the bombings. On page 17, it states these ideas and says, "Clearly, we have only scratched the surface, and the future research will greatly enrich our knowledge of a unique story that started more than 5 centuries ago and stretched over 350 years when Muslim men, women, and children who were sold in the New World. They were among the very first Africans to be deported and among the last. Who would have thought that these people could be in such experience because of what they're doing now? I find it very unfair for people who identify as Muslims because they have to endure so much hatred from people that don't even know who they truly are or what they have gone through."
Personally, the book allowed me to see how the past echoes the present. For example, we talked in class about how because white slave owners suddenly let their slaves practice their own religions, the idea of, oh, maybe they weren't that cruel constructed in the minds of many. Just like today, when the government lets minorities celebrate their cultures and institute things like Black History Month, LGBTQ Month, etc., we think, wow, our country is so open and fair, when in reality, people of color are constantly oppressed and the justice system in place doesn't benefit them, but rather puts them at risk, as we have seen countless times throughout history. It also prompted me to see that Islamophobia has always been a thing, from the Spaniards forcefully converting Muslims in Spain to the U.S. banning immigration from primarily Muslim countries. Because of fear of terrorism, which is one of the major problems today in America, ever since the declaration of the War on Terror, it really gets me thinking and prompts me to pose the question if the War on Terror was just a plot to institutionalize Islamophobia nationwide for the years to come.
Okay, and the last segment is what is revealed through this approach that would otherwise be obfuscated and hazy in the study of history. I feel like the main theme is that this country was founded on Christian beliefs because it was more ethical. But it is clearly evidence that Islam is more ethical than Christianity. Christianity was used and is being used as a means to cover up the reality that slavery was the actual foundation of this country. War is justified in American culture, and as I mentioned previously, 9/11 is a clear example. Muslims were the first slaves to arrive to America, but oftentimes we think that it was the African Americans who were the first ones. We never learn the history of Muslims. In school, they only teach us about the white history. An example is on page 71, it says that scattered across every region of the Americas, the Muslims entered a hostile world, a world that enslaved free Muslims, men and women, a white Christian world determined to wipe out any race of paganism or Mohammedanism in the newly arrived Africans. How is it that the job of the Christians was to kill people and still preach about the love of God when they have to convert to their religion? We have been raised to thinking that the U.S. is a democratic country, but in reality, it's just an empire where the whites basically rule everything. But they obviously don't tell us that because that would make us hate this country and not have the pride that a lot of Americans feel.
Adding on to what Lizette was saying, studying how African Muslims were enslaved in the Americas reveals that at the core, white colonizers used the Christian faith to justify their hate, murders, and genocides. It also broadens your perspective to understand that the United States wasn't the only one mistreating people of color, but it was happening all over the Americas, from Spain to Mexico, from black people to indigenous folk. Chapter 5 especially revealed to me that much of society is uneducated about the origins and history of slavery from the victim perspective, but instead relate more to the typical white colonizer perspective we learn in history from K to 12. In page 211, the author talks about the Wolof, an African population in which he states went from plantation to plantation trying to rally other Africans and killed a dozen whites. This reminded me of the Kanye West incident, which was especially upsetting to see because Kanye stated that slavery was a choice by implying that slaves should have just revolted when it was very clearly written in history that the slaves revolted countless times, fighting fire with fire and killing their oppressors. And while Malcolm X spoke the fact that black folk were not minority, but rather a global majority. Slaves were separated and beaten and abused so badly that it was obvious they couldn't communicate and methodically thought out a plan to revolt together. His statement is an embarrassment as it diminishes the efforts of suffering because black people of color never stopped fighting.
In conclusions, we believe that black Muslims have been treated unfairly and still remain to be. This book has opened all of our thoughts and changed our images on who Muslims truly are. Thank you for listening to our podcast, Who Are the Muslims?